The cult of Satan and its manifestations. Occultism. The Encyclopedia Tricani defines occultism as a set of doctrines founded on a religious, metaphysical, and physical concept of the universe that presupposes the existence of an array of dynamic forces, personal and impersonal, physical or psychic, that are not accessible with the instruments of logic or of the mathematical and experimental sciences. From this point of view, they remain occult, that is, hidden or concealed, but with which a few of the learned are able to establish relationships through cognitive instruments or technical practices. Occultism is, in other words, the great umbrella under which all the practices and forms of satanic adoration are gathered in order to be drawn upon by those who wish to profit from its gains. The most significant forms of occultism are magic, astrology, fortune telling, and or spiritism. At its base, it is the belief in the existence of spiritual forces that cannot be experienced through one's external senses, i.e., touch, sight, and so forth. Therefore, they are esoteric or hidden. By controlling these forces through techniques into which one is initiated, and which parallel the techniques of esotericism, and after practicing them appropriately, one can dominate the reality. These entities, as we shall see, are the unclean spirits commonly called devils. The reality is more complex, however, because the occultists, in order to enjoy their powers, end with putting themselves at the service of the superior hierarchies. After all, the leader of these sects into which they enter is Satan himself, who asks a very high price of those he serves. Satanism. Satanism is the practice of the cult or worship of Satan. It is necessary to say that Satanists and Satanism truly exist. They are not simply in the mind of some imaginative Hollywood director. To be precise, a Satanist is one who explicitly decides to consecrate himself, that is, to give himself through a ritual to Satan and to enter into a sect. These cases are fairly rare. We are speaking of thousands, not millions of persons. Although they are few, they are extremely dangerous to souls. These people who are leading a life of sin are exclusively oriented towards themselves, and they follow the teachings of the Prince of Darkness to the letter. Generally, one distinguishes between a personal Satanism or occultism and an impersonal or rationalist Satanism. The first recognizes the personal nature of Satan, and the followers entreat, adore, and honor him as a god. The second, the impersonal or rationalist, does not believe in Satan's personal nature, that is, in the metaphysical sense. Rather, they see him as a cosmic energy that is present in each man and in the world, and that when called upon will emerge in all his power to carry out the most absurd and atrocious perversions, always connecting them to esoteric rites. What is their objective? Satanists wish to develop this depraved form of devotion through a diffusion of the theory and practice of three basic principles. You can do all that you wish, no one has the right to command you, and you are the God of yourself. The first principle intends to confer full liberty to the adherent on everything he wishes to do, without limits. The second is the release from the principle of authority, that is, from any obligation to obey parents, the church, the state, and whoever places restrictions in the name of the common good. The third denies all the truth that comes directly from God. Paradise, the inferno, purgatory, judgment, the Ten Commandments, the precepts of the church, Mary, and so forth. In appearance, these principles are seductive, especially for younger people, because they delude them into thinking that life is a beautiful holiday in an imaginary land of playthings, where everything is permitted and where your eye does not recognize any limits regarding pleasure and enjoyment. It is my conviction, as well as my heartfelt advice to all parents, that in order to help their children disdain this perspective with its destructive nature, it is necessary to educate them from an early age to cultivate a life of faith through prayer, through the Mass, and through association with the various Catholic youth clubs and other similar organizations. It is absolutely necessary to give them a sense of God and the awareness of the existence of sin and the devil, the tempter who wishes to lead us to a separation from God and therefore to death. These young people, then, when they become older, will probably have developed the right attitudes toward these sects and satanic practices. I am aware that it involves a difficult form of education, but let us always remember that because of the total absence of beautiful and good ideals, young people today are more exposed to these dangers. When faith disappears, one abandons himself to superstition and occultism. Let us return to the Satanists. Since baptized Christians are commonly called children of God, can Satanists be called children of Satan? For them, this is not conceivable. Satan does not desire brothers or friends, much less children. Satan desires only slaves, whom he buys by promising them a guaranteed and unlimited enjoyment of things, with, and here is the great lie, unchecked liberty, which is the foundation of Satanism itself. Consecration to Satan. How does one become a Satanist? Through a rite of consecration to Satan. The person himself hands himself over to Satan in body and soul, asks to be received among his hosts, and thus enters into a sect. It normally involves an agreement written in blood, which sounds more or less like this: Satan, from now on, I belong to you in life and death, and after death, accept me as your acolyte. I give you blah, 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 and I should do what you wish and command, but give me pleasures, success, sex, and riches. Usually the consecration happens during a collective rite, often with a black mass, in which one is initiated into the sect and into the satanic practices. The contract of blood can also be done individually, as with religious vows, which can be made publicly, before an assembly of the people of God, usually during a communal celebration or privately and singularly in secret before God. All these cases concern a true and proper selling of the soul to the devil, who maintains his tragic promises, but without ever giving any happiness, but only innumerable sufferings. In a word, being consecrated to the devil guarantees a life of pure hell on earth and an eternal hell in the afterlife. In my experience, these persons do not ever receive peace, and they leave behind them a trail of sorrow, solitude, and death. The spread of Satanism does not occur solely one-on-one. Many books and pamphlets circulate among young people, and there are also internet sites that teach the formulas of consecration to the Prince of Darkness. It is an extremely dangerous practice. It may be done as a joke or seriously alone in a group. It makes no difference because it can bear very heavy consequences. Even years later, when after having settled down with a spouse, children, and a good job, one must still confront a burdensome diabolical possession. For this reason, it is necessary to think of the consequences of such a choice, which is often irreversible or at least very difficult to reverse. I know persons who have left, but only after an enormous struggle and often while being threatened by the followers. Even more, they always remain marked in their psyche and in their body, often enduring years and years of exorcisms in order to be liberated from the devil and the diabolical possessions on their backs. In brief, it is not a great business. In recent times, various cases of sensational homicides have been reported in the media that are surely ascribable to a particular influence of Satan, perhaps the result of some pact contracted with him. For example, there is the case of the 3 girls of Chiavenna who on June of 2000 killed Sister Maria Laura Manetti. From what I read, I do not believe they were possessed by demons. Rather, I believe they acted under Satan's potent inspiration. The cynicism, the brutality, the lack of restraint, and the wounding of that poor religious could not have been solely their own invention. Immediately afterward, 2 of the 3 went to an amusement park, while the 3rd went home to clean the kitchen knife they used to kill her, replacing it in the drawer. This incredible story confirms the risks that are in play for today's young people. Today in Italy, there are a few hundred satanic sects. Generally, each one has a few members. It is difficult to do a precise charting of them because they always act in the shadows. I wish to conclude with an important observation. It is not necessary to become a Satanist in order to serve the devil and become one of his followers. There are many, alas, who do not officially consecrate themselves to Satan, but choose to follow his basic principles, and as a result, they place their souls at great risk. The powers that come from Satan. One might wonder what powers the devil gives to his devotees, along with the indecipherable sufferings. There is an indeterminable list. Some powers clearly some powers are clearly of a diabolical origin, others require some discernment. Typical powers that are the direct consequence of the sale of one's soul to the devil and of the Satanist's adopted identity at consecration: riches, free sex, and unlimited power. At the beginning, everything comes easily and seems to be a great and beautiful affair, but all of it involves false illusions. Not long afterward, indescribable sufferings take over, signs that the devil has taken them for a ride, because his objective is to make you a slave and ruin your life. I related a testimony of this dramatic reality in a book, The Last Exorcist, The Case of Simona, written with the journalist Paolo Rodari. This young woman had accepted the offer of consecrating herself to Satan in exchange for a luminous career. Soon afterward, she scaled the heights of her company, earning an impressive salary and a high social reputation. The devil had maintained his promise, but in exchange he truly asked for her soul. She found herself living with intense moments of hatred toward certain individuals that were so strong and sudden that each time she would have to shut herself in the bathroom, beating her fists in her head against the wall and screaming with pain. She bitterly repented it, and only after a long journey which I made with her did she manage to regain her liberty definitively. But the price was high. She had to give back the gifts given to her by Satan, and even before she had a chance to renounce her career, she was fired. But this time she was completely free. These powers that the Spiritists call gifts can also be tied to magic rites, spells, the evil eye, charms, etc., done personally or under submission. Among these, which I cite only as examples, are foresight, the capacity to see things that will happen in the future; clairvoyance, the possibility of seeing things in persons in other places that are not visible; visions and apparitions, the phenomena of automatic writing, the inspiration to write messages dictated by external entities; levitation, bilocation; poltergeist activity, the sudden and unexplainable movement of objects. At other times they can hear voices that suggest prayer or curses, or have visions, or even feel lightly touched by a spiritual entity. Some of these phenomena can be attributed to the supernatural, that is, to God, but only when there is convincing proof. Otherwise, when they are suspicious enough, I tend to place them in the sphere of the preternatural, that is, the diabolical. But it is always the church that must determine their divine providence. When I recommended first in these cases is not to pay attention to these voices, visions, and interior inspirations, and to refuse these powers expressively, always calling on the Virgin Mary for spiritual help. I also advise a person to place himself in the hands of a spiritual advisor, a priest, who will ponder the matter. In the case of the persistence of the phenomena, one can ask to receive some exorcisms and some prayers of deliverance in order to verify that these powers are not associated, as it often happens, with an evil spell, possession, vexation, obsession, and infestation. Never, and I say never, should one feel privileged and therefore inspired to use these powers. It would be like saying yes to Satan. The Black Mass, a parody of the Eucharistic celebration. I have spoken of the Black Mass as a ceremony during which the consecration to Satan occurs. The Black Mass is a parody of the Catholic Mass in which one adores and exalts Satan. Usually it is officiated at night, because the darkness permits greater secrecy and because during the night fewer people are found at prayer, which disturbs the ritual. During the celebration, the words and the external signs of the Eucharistic liturgy are used, but always in a contrary sense, in order to manifest opposition to God. There is always a satanic priest officiating who wears blasphemous vestments, an altar represented by a nude woman, possibly a virgin, on whom very serious acts of profanity of the Eucharist, usually stolen from a church, are performed, with words of consecration proclaimed in a contrary sense, and an overturned crucifix. Only members of the satanic sect who are sworn to secrecy may participate. Non-members are never permitted to attend unless it is hoped that, having already been seduced by the perversions and the illusions of power, they may decide to enter the sect. In general, the Black Masses are celebrated by small groups of 10 or at most 15 of the faithful. Once the ritual is concluded, the woman who functioned as the altar is raped in turn by all the participants, first by the one who exercised the rites of the priest, then by all the others. This woman may have freely accepted that role, or she may have been led there against her will. And aside from the physical violence, she often suffers the terrible consequences of the ritual, which is diabolical possession. As in the church, some of the official rites are required and are tied to particular feast days. The most important is Halloween, which falls on the night between October 31st and November 1st of each year. It is considered the Magic New Year. Therefore, it is necessary to understand the extreme danger for our children and youth who participate in the Feast of Halloween on that date. The second precedes our feast of the presentation of Jesus in the temple on February 2nd. The night before, in fact, begins the magic spring. The summer magic is the third satanic solemnity and occurs on the night between April 30th and May 1st. During the year, Satanists often choose nights when the new moon is inaugurated because it is particularly dark. The officiator of these rites is usually someone who is consecrated to Satan, and although it is not stated, this person is also usually possessed by the devil. It may also not be so. I am certain, however, that during these rituals, as stated above, the Eucharistic hosts are profaned, having been stolen from the tabernacles or taken by some of the faithful at communion during Mass and not consumed. I once exorcised a person who had purloined a consecrated host during a Mass in order to participate at a black Mass. He robbed hosts everywhere, even though he had already begun a courageous path towards liberation. According to what he told me, he was acting in a state of complete unconsciousness. That is, in the state of a trance typical of persons possessed by the devil. Black magic, a grave sin against the faith. We now arrive at the central point of our discourse, magic. It would not have made sense to speak of Satanism and black masses without seriously confronting the subject of magic. On this topic, the Catechism of the Catholic Church furnishes the best definition. All practices of magic or sorcery by which one attempts to tame occult powers so as to place them at one's service and have a supernatural power over others, even if this were for the sake of restoring their health, are gravely contrary to the virtue of religion. Number 2117. The Church condemns such practices on the basis of revelation and on the conviction that in Spiritism and Occultism it is the devil who is acting. The Exorcists, as always, testify to this without a shadow of a doubt. The definition of magic tells us two things. Above all, it has ambition. Through the utilization of evil spells, the evil eye, charms, magic philters, rituals, invocations, cursed foods and drinks ingested by the victims, crystal balls, etc., to modify and foretell the course of human events and to utilize the preternatural powers to make a person fall in love, be cured of an illness, be dismissed from a job, kill someone, provoke atmospheric events, etc. In other words, magic is a practice used to do evil things and to influence people in the reality created by the devil. This is also valid for the rites that are commonly called white magic, in that are done for the good, in the sense that they promote ends that are not apparently wicked, as for example, finding a job. In red magic, which regards the sphere of sexuality and influences the sentiments, all turn to the same preternatural entity, the wizard, who in all cases resorts to the power of Satan in order to obtain the invoked result. Therefore, there is no difference among them, black, white, or red. It is enough to see the effects of all of them. I personally knew the case of a girl who was turning to a wizard in order to make the young man she was in love with leave his fiancé so that she could marry him. Alas, the thing worked. First the young man left his fiancé, and then he married the girl who had commissioned the spell. The marriage was a real Calvary. The second aspect that emerges from the Catechism's definition is that magic is seriously contrary to the first commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. Exodus 23. Whoever turns to witches, fortune tellers, occultists, or wizards commits a very serious sin of superstition, which is contrary to the faith. But what is superstition? The term superstition derives from the Latin superstitio and indicates that something is superimposed on another, distorting the original sense. One is superstitious when one believes that something innocent in itself brings misfortune. The classic black cat that crosses one's path, spilling salt on the pavement, breaking a mirror, or that it brings luck, the rabbit's foot, an iron horseshoe crossing one's fingers. That is, when one attributes to certain objects or deeds a power based on their intrinsic essence. There are superstitions that also regard religious deeds or facts, such as superimposing a true piety on a false religion, that is, attributing power to objects and rites that are exteriorly Christian. This happens when practices and rites are carried out or formulas of our faith are professed, making all their efficacy depends on rigid observance or pre-established forms and times. For example, on November 2nd, a certain number of souls will be freed from purgatory. Here it is evident that a magical mentality is present that deforms the true piety. In the case cited, it is only the mercy of God that can freely deliver a certain number of souls from purgatory. Our intercession, which is always appropriate, would be thwarted by this mentality that demands using prayer as a secret technique to obtain results, nearly forcing God to grant them. True piety is prayerful supplication, places everything in God's hands, knowing that He, in His liberty and sovereignty, whether pleasing us or not, will always act for our good and for the persons and situations for which we pray. This mixing of the sacred and the profane, which unfortunately is so present today even in the Christian community, for example, the hanging of a horseshoe around a statue of the Madonna in order to implore good luck, is superstitious. It leads individuals to divination, magic, and witchcraft, with the exception of gaining supernatural power over their neighbors. The expectation of gaining supernatural power over their neighbors. As the Catechism says, even if this were for the sake of restoring their health, it is gravely contrary to the virtue of religion. Unfortunately, there are many who resort to witches or wizards. Our own Western world, rich and hyper-technical, has much in common with primitive populations and with the culture of the late Middle Ages. Both knew the preternatural powers well. Even today, many persons will wink at magic and its priests, wizards, and sorcerers. One of my dear friends, a scholar who died in 2005, Cecilia Gatto Tracci, claimed that in Italy there are more than 13 million Italians who patronize sorcerers, a tsunami compared with the paltry number of priests and exorcists in the country. The only remedy, even if the episode occurred many years ago, is to issue an invitation to all those involved to repent and to confess this sin with the firm intention of not doing anything so foolish again. At this point, a question comes to mind. Is a person in God's grace preserved from the effects of magical rites? It is certainly more difficult to strike a person in such a state, although it is not impossible. Being that each thing is freely at God's disposal, an evil can be permitted to be transmitted through a magical act and to do damage to one who lives in communion with God. The most common examples of magic are evil spells. Evil spells is a generic phrase which includes all the forms in which someone is harmed through the occult, hidden action of the devil, and its various rites. Among those they make use of are spells, the evil eye, curses, macumbo, voodoo, and satanic rites, to cite the most common. The objectives are to divide, to kill, to make fall in love, to make ill, to destroy, to lead to suicide, and to divide spouses, the engaged, and friends. In order to bring about an evil spell, 3 things are necessary: a witch or a wizard, a person who commissions the witch or wizard, and an object on which the ritual is performed. As the sacraments have visible signs, for example, bread and wine in the Eucharist, evil spells also have theirs, such as clothing, photos, personal items, and foods, that are cursed by the wizard with formulas and rituals that are intended to produce negative spiritual effects on the persons affected. The sacraments, which work ex opere operato, from the work performed, do not confer grace without the personal dispositions of faith and acceptance on the part of the faithful who are enjoying them. Magic functions differently. The wizard must win over the action of the evil spirit, pressing it into service with invocations and prayers. The effect on the victim, however, is separate from his own personal inclinations, although, as I have said, a person in a state of grace with God is less vulnerable to the attack of an evil spell. How evil spells can manifest themselves. Some years ago, I exorcised a young man who had broken up with his fiancée after a 6-year engagement. Soon after, he began to complain of sudden physical disturbances. Added to that fact was the impossibility, verified during a long period, of finding another fiancé or a job. It was then discovered during the prayer of the exorcism that the aspiring mother-in-law was not resigned to the breakup of her daughter's engagement and had commissioned an evil spell from a witch. The young man turned to me, and after some exorcisms, the physical ills nearly disappeared, even if he was not able to find another fiancé or another job. Another case is that of a man who opened a shop in a city plaza. The business was doing well. Then one day, a competitor opened a business in that same plaza. Suddenly, no one, not even the most loyal clients, would set foot in the first shop. In that case, I verified a sort of local infestation. Thus, I celebrated some masses inside the shop and personally imparted blessings in local exorcisms. Slowly, the clients returned. How did I become aware that something was not right? The complete and sudden change was too suspicious to be normal. In this type of case, where reasonable social or scientific explanations are lacking, it is always appropriate to do something. A fine benediction, for example. The evil eye is a different case, rarer and even less easy to figure out. It involves tossing out a spell through the power of a glance with the objective of sending over the devil. It has nothing to do with popular traditions such as carrying a good luck charm or looking cross-eyed at someone. Rather, it involves a true and proper rite. I must say, however, that I have never had a case clearly tied to this practice. Is a person ever aware of having suddenly been subjected to a spell? It is difficult, although theoretically possible, that a person who has been subjected to an evil spell may never, in the course of his life, be aware of it. Above all, it is necessary to say that spells do not always reach their targets, either because the person may be well protected in his life of grace, or because God may not permit it, or because the wizard or sorcerer may not succeed. Perhaps because the demon, the prince of lies, can deceive his own followers. At other times they hit the mark, and we shall treat the results in the next chapter when we speak of individual evil spirits, diabolical possession, physical and psychological obsessions, and local infestations. This can happen also at a distance of much time. Here are some examples. I have had a case involving persons who did not know that they had been subjected to evil spells until they were casual participants in a prayer of liberation service with a group of Catholic charismatic renewal. In that circumstance, they suddenly began to feel sick, to shout, and to curse, which for them was absurd and unthinkable behavior. After they discovered the evil spell, they immediately began to repair the situation by beginning a serious journey of faith, which is always necessary in these cases, by participating in a prayer encounter and subjecting themselves to exorcisms. Another interesting question is, when does the evil spell occur? There are countless responses. For instance, it can occur in the womb, even before the victim's birth. It can also occur during infancy or in youth or adolescence. I recall a spell in which a little girl was told, "You will never marry." She was a beautiful girl, good and smart. When she grew up, all her engagements were inevitably broken off for the oddest reasons. Another cursed person whom I followed for a long time was left by his future spouse on the day of the wedding. Everything was ready: home, church rings, invitations, restaurant. Then on the fated day she did not present herself. A spell had been cast against that spousal union. At other times the rites are completed later, at a more mature age, or during the victim's old age. It is necessary to remember that a spell can also activate itself, through the will of the wizard or the client, at some time in the future, such as the moment of baptism or a marriage. In that case, the disturbance, often the diabolical possession, is scheduled to begin on that particular day. In the case of the baptism of a baby, it is difficult to establish it with certainty, since the infant is not able to describe the disturbances he has suffered. Generally, the parents understand it sometime in the future, when the child is able to describe his ailments. It is always important to understand the circumstances, the time and the place of the evil's initiation, as well as the person who commissions the spell. At times it involves a relationship, even a very old one, that is characterized by perfidy, hate, and antipathy toward the victim. It is also necessary to know that spells are often inflicted through the preparation of foods to be ingested by the victims. Obviously, it is very difficult to prevent this type of spiritual poisoning. I am often asked if the wizards or the witches themselves, those who cast the spells, are always necessarily possessed. I think so, even if they are not aware of it or do not believe in these things. Magicians, wizards, sorcerers, and witches know that they have certain powers. It is something that gives them immense pleasure, and they use them to make people suffer, which also gives them pleasure. Furthermore, the wizards themselves will often submit to the spells, naturally for profit, since they do everything for money. Then the practice of magic worsens their situation. Prayer can counter evil spells, and if done with faith and love, it reaches its objective, which is the heart of God. We also know that God himself will dispose of things according to a plan whose ultimate end is always a greater good, eternal life. Each prayer, prayed with this intention, is effective, and at times the Lord in his infinite goodness will grant us assistance and graces that are much greater than the fruit of our prayer. Wizards, fortune-tellers, and witches. One cannot speak of magic without speaking of wizards or sorcerers, those who are particularly adept at attracting and influence the unfortunates who turn to them in a state of prostration over a personal matter, or for other superstitious attitudes already mentioned. They receive their clients in a study purposely decked out with small statues of Our Lady, the saints, candles, incense, soft lighting, and everything that serves to create a magical, esoterical atmosphere, so useful in subjugating the naive adventurers. No one doubts that there are many braggarts, false charismatics, and false wizards in circulation. They may even be the majority. They advertise on television and magazines, and today, above all, on the internet. They are swindlers who make money at the expense of the poor simpletons who entrust themselves to them to resolve their problems. The false wizards complete their rites without obtaining any evident result. For example, they give a charm or an amulet, at a high price obviously, in order to protect the client from something, or they hand him a sack filled with dirt taken from a cemetery and flavored with the bones of the dead and menstrual blood, and all without resolving anything. Above all, in order to keep a hold on the client, they make him return each month to recharge and to pour out more change. On the other hand, there are true wizards and witches who are often disguised as seers, who practice occultism, spiritism, and Satanism as a true and proper profession. Perhaps they are a minority, but they are extremely effective. Through their rituals and the actions of Satan, these people truly obtain what they seek. That is the misery of their unfortunate victims through sickness, the loss of a job, the breakup of a relationship, or forced marriages or engagements, the collapse of business affairs, and physical and psychological illnesses. The history of cases is infinite. What is certain is that they turn to the occult forces, seeking their services. They are the idolaters and the worshippers of false gods who consistently try to gain some personal advantage. They are apostates because they favor the action of the devil, who, although he has already been defeated by the resurrection of Christ and its effects in the church, is still operative in the world thanks to their perfidy. The dramatic increase in the number of possessed persons and spiritual disturbances makes me say that the malice and superstition of those who resort to them, including those who, even as a joke, practice forms of occultism such as seances, has grown in correspondence with the generalized decline of the faith and the spreading of a culture favoring magic. Television series such as Witches and films such as Harry Potter are, in my view, a devastating means of sowing suspicion in the minds of young people and the not so young, and of cultivating a magical mentality. What is a magical mentality if not thinking that reality can be modified with the wave of a wand? Also relevant to the topic is how one becomes a wizard. There is a type of bona fide initiation along with courses that introduce a person to this art. One does not learn in the blink of an eye how to recite formulas, perform rituals, or use instruments of healing or prediction such as pendulums, palm reading, divining, and fortune-telling cards. I believe that the paths of initiation are very diverse because they involve occultists who do not wish to operate in the light of day. There is also the Book of Commands, a very ancient text of black magic that is accessible to those who are entrusted with the transmission of its very powerful formulas. Wizards work mostly at night. After appeasing Satan with some appropriate rites of adoration, they act on photographs, puppets, or other objects belonging to the one who will be struck. Then, through the intervention of the spirits, the wizards invoke the spiritually negative effects ritually propitiated on such objects will be transferred to the person himself. It is necessary to clarify that all the consequences of the occult, possessions, obsessions, the evil eye, strange powers, and similar things have been caused by the influence of Satan and activated by wizards, cannot evidently be reversed by them. On the contrary, their intervention would only worsen things. At times they boast of being exorcists, but what they claim as powers of liberation from evil spells are nothing but a product of Satan. In the end, one is always worse than before, and with the additional weight of a personal tie to a wizard. It is necessary to distrust a wizard who boasts of such powers. A demon is not chased away with a demon, only with prayer. In these cases, it is necessary to resort to a priest, an exorcist, or the prayer groups of the Catholic Charismatic Renewal. Finally, I am often asked if wizards can go back to the faith. Wizards, like exorcists, even if obviously on the completely opposite side, touch the invisible world with their hands. When a true wizard sells himself to Satan, his reasoning is no longer his own, and normally he does not have the strength to liberate himself. For this reason, I believe that it is difficult, if not impossible, to convert back to God. God will seek to redeem him, even to the end, as he does with all his children. An exorcist related to me the case of a witch who remained in agony on her deathbed for many hours, and who amid great pains and sufferings was unable to die. By chance the exorcist had found himself at the hospital where the witch was languishing, and did an exorcism on her. And after a while she expired, reconciled with God, we hope. Spiritism. Spiritism is the evocation of the dead through a medium. The medium is a type of spiritist priest who functions as a channel or means of communication with the spiritual world in order to learn hidden things or to know the fate of a dearly departed. There are, in fact, many unilluminated by Christian faith who, at the death of a dear person or in the unrestrained desire to know the future, turn out of desperation to mediums, often with inauspicious effects on their lives. How does the evocation of the dead occur? It happens through various techniques that come from a very ancient tradition, which, like those involved in other types of magic, have been developed and perfected by spiritist movements that have studied and practiced them in depth since the second half of the 1800s. Since then, Spiritism has evolved into a universal religion that, guided by spirits, is expected by its followers to overcome the traditional religions and draw all humanity to a new era of brotherhood. Culturally and politically, it resembles Freemasonry, to which many members of Spiritism belong. Their techniques are easily accessed, and for this reason they constitute an easy entrance for the curious who wish to venture in. The most common is the seance, in which several persons are seated around a table, holding hands or resting them on the surface, with little fingers touching in order to maintain physical contact as though a chain. If the evocation of the spirit succeeds, the table moves itself and speaks by striking some blows, which have a conventional meaning, for example, 1 blow for yes and 2 for no. The evoked spirit can also speak through the medium, who, having fallen into a trance, lends his voice to the spirit, or through a pendulum through automatic writing, in which always during the trance the medium writes what he says is dictated by the spirit, or through a Ouija board, on which a little plate or a coin is moved, going from one letter of the alphabet to another to form words and concepts that the spirits wish to reveal. Also here, as in magic, there are many braggarts who look to make money at the expense of those who are suffering. But there are also many mediums who are truly able to get in contact with spiritual entities. These presumed spirits of the dead often reveal things that are unknown to the medium himself, but are known to the client, who, at once conquered by the credibility of the voice, does not hesitate to believe all the other revelations in future sessions. Often these voices announce beautiful things or leave edifying messages that are difficult to ignore. In brief, Spiritism in these cases seems to work, and it draws many followers. The fact, then, that they are able to obtain information about events that have truly happened or are unknown to the medium leads us to attribute these communications to an intelligent external cause, that is, to spirits. But of what exactly are we speaking? According to an important trend in Spiritism, that of Allan Kardec, there are souls in the temporal stage between one reincarnation and another that are in sight of their progressive elevation and are wandering. Being disincarnated, they are therefore available to speak. Good spirits are distinguished from spirits that are less good depending on their level of perfection. All of this, of course, is completely contrary to Christian doctrine. There are no good spirits other than angels and no bad spirits other than demons. Another, more ethnic trend, like that of the traditional Afro-American cults, holds that these souls are of divine nature, and that during the rituals they are appropriated by the medium in order to pronounce oracles or dictate blessings or curses on someone. In the West, in the 1970s, those who practice so-called channeling, a form of New Age Spiritism, claim to be able to contact through a channel all the invisible entities such as angels, gnomes, goblins, elves, fairies, spirits of nature, spirits of fire, spirits of water, and the great spirit of the earth. Clearly, this phenomenon of neo-paganism that is part of the New Age movement is winning over many lost and disoriented souls right now. There are some who would simplify this broad phenomenology which we have just sketched here in some of its particular forms, preferring to speak of the parapsychology, projections of the unconscious, and other phenomena that have a psychological character with no effective correspondence in reality. My idea, however, is that these evoked spirits, if they are not the result of banal tricks, are none other than demons. But first let us see what the Church says on the topic, beginning with the many passages from the Old Testament in which necromancy, the evocation of the dead, divination, and witchcraft are forbidden to the Israelites as superstitious practices that turn the heart away from the faith in Yahweh, the providential God. Then, in addition to the many pronouncements of the magisterium through the centuries, there is also the Catechism, which says all forms of divination are to be rejected. Recourse to Satan or demons, conjuring up the dead, or other practices falsely supposed to unveil the future, consulting horoscopes, astrology, palm reading, interpretation of omens and lots, the phenomenon of clairvoyance, and recourse to mediums, all conceal a desire for power over time, history, and in the last analysis, other human beings, as well as a wish to conciliate hidden powers. They contradict the honor, respect, and loving fear that we owe to God alone. In light of this, in my long exorcistical practice, I believe that the evoked, presumed souls of the deceased, those that in precedence I called roaming or wandering, are in reality unclean awakened spirits attracted, indeed forced, by the evocation to manifest themselves. I also believe that to lead or simply to assist at such practices, even only occasionally, besides being a mortal sin, can provoke concrete and serious harm to the spirit. My agenda is full of appointments given to those who have consulted a medium. These individuals tell me that after such experiences, even long after, their problems increase. They have difficulty sleeping. They perceive some strange presences in their ambiances. They find it difficult to study. They experience a growing desire to commit suicide. They develop an unexplainable hatred towards others, and they become besieged by obsessive thoughts. Unfortunately, the list could be lengthened to include the risks of contracting a serious spiritual evil such as a diabolical possession. The correlation between the cause and the diagnosis is so frequent that it is difficult for me to think that Spiritism has nothing to do with the demon. The fact is, and I base this on the experience of my colleagues in this ministry, that these evils are curable only through the medicine of the Spirit, exorcism, blessings, prayer, and the sacraments, and this leads to the confirmation of all that I have said. There are so many young people I am speaking of, 25 out of every 100, who together with their peers, either for a joke or out of boredom, get involved in these practices or participate at least once in their life at a seance. It is curious that in a secularized and scientific era like ours, where anything credible must be experimentally demonstrated, so many people dive into these types of experiences that deal so strongly with the invisible world. The response is quite simple. When faith in God declines, idolatry and irrationality increase. Man must then look elsewhere for answers to his meaningful questions. But there is another response that seems to me to go even deeper. A highly technical society accustoms individuals to obtain all that they wish by clicking a button, so they avail themselves of this method in order to obtain responses to the more difficult questions. For clarity, I wish to further speak about two other types, namely sensitives and seers. Like mediums or wizards, both can be braggarts, or worse, real witches or wizards. But there are also others in this category who are inspired to do good and sense or see spiritual realities. If they have a solid faith, and if they do not seek glory or gain, and if when tested they prove to be trustworthy, they can be very useful. I know some of them, and I employ them when it is helpful. By going back to a photograph of a person, a letter, or an object, they can with a certain precision identify the existence of the spell and its origin, thereby permitting the identification and the destruction of the material cause. Furthermore, they can also assist in the selection of the most adaptable spiritual medicine to apply a particular situation. In my experience, it has often happened that they can identify which parts of the victim's body to anoint, that is, where he was directly struck by the spell, or they can discern the time in which the person sustained the results of a rite. Satanic rock, the collective exaltation that kills the soul. Without a shadow of a doubt, the most diffuse method of transmitting the principles of Satanism is satanic rock. This makes Satanism live through music, which in and of itself is common and beautiful form of entertainment. However, the Mephistophelian sound represents a great and actual danger for young people, who are the majority of those who are attracted to it, and in a certain sense the most defenseless. In the messages that are transmitted through the sounds of satanic rock are the 3 rules of Satanism. You may do all that you wish. No one has the right to command you, and you are the god of yourself. Between the performances and the collective exaltation created as entertainment and presented in a stadium, satanic rock very much mirrors the desires of young people. Satanic rock's contagious music gives a sense of cheer, self-possession, and unlimited liberty from parents, teachers, and educators. If it is true that it is not necessary to see the devil everywhere, then for some this music is only a passion, although morbid, but it seems to me that the most devoted followers of this particular musical genre belong to satanic sects. So I advise everyone to avoid poisoning their spirits with these sounds. Does one also risk diabolical possession by listening to this music? I have never had a case in which I was able with great certainty to recognize a possession caused by satanic rock. Nevertheless, I was able to ascribe other disturbances to it, none the less painful, such as vexations or diabolical obsessions that provoke suicidal or homicidal inclinations. It is also necessary to remember that satanic rock spreads messages that are taken from the manuals of the black masses, Spiritism, and Occultism, in which Satan is invoked with musical lyrics that are actual hymns to the Prince of Darkness. And when they are projected onto a screen at concerts, they become, in a subliminal way, provocations of violent suicide, sexual perversion, and acts of destruction against the state, the civic order, and the Church of God. Satanic rock is a conditioning. It overwhelms the external senses, sight and hearing, and arriving directly at the subconscious erodes over time its inhibiting brakes. The obsessive repetition of these messages literally changes the way one thinks of and understands life, poisoning the soul and the spirit, and as a result, ruining lives. Cursing, a poisoning of the environment. It is common knowledge that some people, even the young and little children, curse. But can these expressions, which often seem more like interjections than real offenses against God and Our Lady, cause collateral damage in terms of evil spells? First of all, let us say that those who curse are in good company. The demoniacs, those possessed by the devil, often curse. Many persons, perhaps the majority, do not have a true awareness of the monstrosity they speak when they are cursing, offending the one who created them and insulting the mother of the one who saved them. Rudeness, bad habits, and contagion accompanying cursing. Furthermore, it is a grave sin that must be confessed. Certainly, cursing is not at all displeasing to the devil. I personally have direct evidence of a cause-effect relationship between cursing and diabolical possession. I have been involved in cases regarding persons who contracted a diabolical possession or another evil spell caused by cursing. I also recall, without going too far, that it created a climate adaptable for similar phenomena. Certainly, apart from everything else, cursing ruins the climate of a home, which is the center of our lives. What can we do when we hear someone cursing? I advise, in defense of a place or a family, to repeat in your minds a very short prayer. For example, Jesus, I love you, or Blessed be Jesus. This type of reparation is an effective retort against the devil, who at that point has more to lose than to gain from a curse. Horror films, piercings, and tattoos. What type of influence do books and especially horror films have on a spiritual life? A negative one. To read crime stories in the newspapers is to ask, where does reality end and fantasy begin? At times there is a connection between the two, a reciprocal influence between what happens in life and what is born in the minds of writers and dramatists. I often wonder who inspires whom. I oppose the viewing of horror films, and I advise people, particularly young, not to patronize them. If the demon's mission is to tempt man, then viewing these films, which trend to normalize brutal situations, particularly where the demon is the protagonist, can seriously upset fragile minds and stir others to sadistic situations. Sorry. Why voluntarily subject oneself to evil temptations? The same regards similar content in animated cartoons and comics for boys and girls. I must admit, however, based on my knowledge and experience, that the viewing of these films does not directly cause extraordinary spiritual ills. If anything, patronizing such films may influence a person to procure them indirectly or induce him to give himself over to occultism. Nevertheless, whoever contributes to the production and distribution of these films is in every case doing a disservice to society. Tattoos and piercings. These, as we know, are very common aesthetic practices among the young and the not-so-young. Tattoos and piercings, like non-satanic rock, do not necessarily have an evil objective and do not in themselves demonize. Man from time immemorial has adorned his body. But I ask myself, does adorning with an indelible images on the skin embellish or disfigure the body, God's creation, and therefore already beautiful in itself? In our view as exorcists, it is always necessary to look at the intentions. Some of the symbolism in the designs on the body can make explicit or implicit referral to monsters or demons, nearly invoking them. At times, one can associate these forms of expression as signs of belonging to the devil. In this case, they are connected to the satanic rites of initiation. Other times, more simply, it is done to impress friends. Still other times, it can be done by explicit sexual references or to scorn one's own body. All these examples do nothing good for the soul. In a few cases, sacred images are represented. These are listed. Ethnic objects. A word about so-called ethnic objects, handmade African, Asian, or South American objects, such as masks or other artifacts that are easily bought at open markets. Can they hide some evil influence? It is an interesting question, but one cannot give a definitive response. Certainly there is a risk that an object of such a nature could have been part of a magic rite intended to harm the future possessors. Initially, I would say not to dramatize it. Above all, if it was given as a gift with good and sincere intentions. A little vigilance, however, is not wasted. At this point, I wish to summarize what I have already said about magic. It has very ancient origins, and it is present in practically every culture. Magic consists in the recourse to the preternatural, that is, to demonic forces, in order to influence humans' events to one's own advantage or to the detriment of somebody else. Whoever practices it, from the wizard to the client, entrusts himself to the devil, which is a serious sin. Magic is either imitative or contagious. Imitative magic uses a form that in some way resembles the person on whom the rite is being carried out. For example, one punctures a puppet with a nail or a needle in order to strike the person the puppet represents. Here a type of transfer occurs from the object to the person. But magic of the contagious or infective type occurs through contact with objects that have belonged to the person, such as articles of clothing or other household items, or by making the person ingest cursed foods. Whenever these objects have been cursed, they transfer their negative potential to the person. Let us return to the African mask and to the other souvenirs from exotic places. They can hide a negative effect, but do not necessarily do so. It is a risk and a danger, however, for anyone to buy them or accept them. I certainly would not wish to have them in my home. What tells us that they are cursed? Above all, when they inspire a sudden aversion toward the sacred. They also cause local disturbances, obscure presences, nauseating odors, unnatural noises, the persistence of a negative physical symptoms on people, and negative personal and work-related situations. Therefore, it is a good rule to have these objects blessed. In the case of clearly self-evident problems, it is necessary to liberate oneself immediately from the object, either by burning it or by tossing it where water flows, such as a river, canal, or sea. Do the sins of our ancestors affect our life? Another theme that pops up, usually in a charismatic setting, is the so-called genetic tree. It is a controversial topic. There are those who maintain that the consequences of their ancestors, mediumism, and particularly some of their serious sins, such as homicide, abortion, suicide, and magical practices, are passed on to successive generations. The same would be valid for their positive attitudes, such as courage and generosity. But here I am speaking of sins, not moral faults, and some of their consequences, which include a propensity or an innate inclination to repeat the same sinful acts. In other words, there could exist a generational transmission not only of a physical and psychological traits, but also spiritual, such as a particular sensibilities tied to serious sins or vices, ascribable to ancestors and propagated from father to son. In brief, it would be a type of spiritual pollution that affects children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so on down the genealogical tree. To liberate oneself from these tendencies, each descendant would have to denounce them expressly through a Christian lifestyle and prayer life, in particular prayers of deliverance, which would cut these ties. Once the sinful tendency was identified and a path of purification taken up, one's faults would be corrected and one's ways mended. Similarly, this would heal the transmission of the insanity characteristic from one generation to another. This evocative thesis has been diffused through books by the English psychiatrist Kenneth McCall entitled Healing the Haunted, 1989, in which the author maintains, citing cases known to him, that the cause of evil spells can depend on genealogical questions. He also speaks of the healing masses of the genealogical tree. These masses are offered as intercession for the deceased who, because of their sins, still do not enjoy the light of God and who are still in purgatory. In his book, McCall cites some episodes in which after these charismatic masses, the negative effects of the suffering souls on the living disappear. Apart from our beliefs on this matter, it is always opportune to celebrate masses for our dear deceased, even those whom have never known and who perhaps lived centuries ago. Among exorcists, there is no uniform position on the genealogical tree. Each one develops a personal position based on his considerable experience. I have had some cases in which persons suffering demonic possessions had ancestors who practiced magic and witchcraft. Moreover, I have ascertained that a curse can be transmitted from one generation to the next, particularly if it is issued by a father or a mother against the son, his marriage, and his future children. For many years I followed a youth who was cursed in the womb by his father. In fact, he was unwanted. And the father continued to curse him, so that when he was grown, this unlucky youth had to deal with many misfortunes. He took good advantage of the blessings that he received from me and from other exorcists, but these had a limited effect. An even more glaring case was that of a young woman whose parents opposed her marriage to the young man of her choice. They cursed her on the very day of her marriage, wishing her the worst evils, and this was unfailingly accomplished. Only years after prayer alleviated the sorrows and sufferings of this young family. Alas, curses which are wishes of evil are extremely powerful, especially if they are made with real treachery by those who are related by varying degrees of kinship to the victim. But they can be conquered with blessings. Jesus said, "Bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you." Luke 6:28. In my view, there is not enough evidence to support the transgenerational thesis. My teacher, Father Candidio Amatini, had serious doubts that sinful tendencies spread generationally. Moreover, would not the adherence to this hypothesis permit a person to abandon his sense of responsibility for his own life? But even with this doubt, I always advise the afflicted to make whatever sacrifices are necessary to break each evil spell.